First, I just want to take a moment and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the Alzheimer Society of Canada's first estate planning webinar. My name is Madison Purdue. I'm the Legacy Specialist at the Alzheimer Society of Canada, and I am just so happy to be hosting this today. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. So first, we acknowledge that we exist on the traditional and ancestral territories of Indigenous peoples. This land has been inhabited, cared for, and governed by First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We recognize that these lands include both treaty and unceded territories and regions governed by long-standing Indigenous cultures and traditions. We recognize the enduring presence and inherent rights and cultures of all Indigenous people and affirm our collective responsibility to uphold the spirit and intent of treaty relationships where they exist and to engage in meaningful acts of reconciliation. We are committed to ongoing learning, reflection, and meaningful action in support of truth and reconciliation. It's wonderful to have so many of our longtime supporters and donors from across the country here today. We're deeply grateful for your continued commitment to improving the lives of people living with dementia and their families. Your dedication really makes it possible to provide essential services across Canada and to fund critical research aimed at preventing dementia and enhancing the quality of life for those affected. Thank you for everything you do for our mission, and thank you for being here today. Before we get started, I'll also share a quick few housekeeping notes. First, you'll notice that everyone is muted. This is to ensure the best experience for all. However, we do really encourage you to use the Q&A function. Christine will be answering all of your questions by the end of the presentation. Today's session is also being recorded and will be shared with you afterwards in case you'd like to revisit any of the content. Apologies. For those joining us in French captions are available, but please note you have to join from your browser to use them. You cannot join from the Teams app. Instructions have been emailed to you and are listed in the chat now in order to just turn on the translation function. Today's session is designed to empower you with valuable knowledge about estate planning, an important step in ensuring peace of mind for you and the people and causes you care about. Your generosity plays a vital role in advancing dementia research, care, and advocacy across Canada, and we want to ensure you have access to the tools and guidance that support your own planning and wishes for the future. We're honored to be joined today by Christine Van Cauwenberghe, Head of Financial Planning at IG Wealth Management, expert estate and tax lawyer, and author of Wealth Planning Strategies for Canadians. Christine has extensive experience helping Canadians make informed decisions about their financial and legacy goals, and we're so grateful to have her here with us. Christine, thank you so much for being here today. To kick you off in today's presentation, I would like to start with the first question that really comes to my mind when I hear estate planning, which is, why is it so important to have an estate plan, and how is it different from having a will?
Thanks very much, Madison. And first of all, I'd like to say thank you for inviting me to participate today. As you know, IG is the major corporate partner for Alzheimer's, and we're very pleased to be associated with Alzheimer's. You guys are doing fantastic work, and we appreciate the opportunity to be of assistance and participate in the conversation. But yes, as you mentioned, the conversation today is about estate planning and planning for dementia. And I think the reason why it's so important to think about estate planning as a whole is sometimes people just think about drafting a will, and a will is very important, but it's not your entire estate plan. It's an important component of an estate plan. When we think about estate planning, we're taking a broader view, so we want to make sure we know who all of your intended beneficiaries are. So that obviously could be family, but it could also be charities or friends. Not everyone necessarily has immediate family that they want to leave assets to. So who is part of your beneficiary group? Are there enough estate assets to even leave enough of an estate? So do you have young children? Do you have older people who are dependent on you? So what is in the estate? Does that need to be enhanced in any way, perhaps through insurance, other means, but what is required to be left? And then how are we going to make sure it's left in the most appropriate manner? And a lot of people don't realize that there are many estates where the will it becomes almost irrelevant because they do so many other things. They add joint owners to assets. They add direct beneficiaries to assets. They do other things. They have shareholders agreements and domestic contracts, which dictate how certain assets need to be distributed. So yes, a will is very important, but it has to work in conjunction with those other documents. And also in the context of dealing with dementia, you want to make sure that you have a power of attorney and have things in place in case you're alive, but you don't have capacity to make decisions. So it is a much broader discussion than just a will. And it's about making sure that you're leaving the type of legacy you want to leave and hopefully maintaining family harmony.
Absolutely. That was a great explanation. Speaking of wills specifically, why is it important to have a will, even if you don't think you own very much?
Well, a will is, after I said it's not the only thing, it's probably the most important part of your estate plan. It is the centerpiece for most people. And it is the document where you are going to name a couple of very important people, one being your executors, and the other being a guardian of any children. And I often say, when people say, when's the most important time to have a will? It's when you have young children. You need to make sure that you've indicated who will take care of those children in the event you're not capable of doing so. Court will always have the final say and has to approve that choice, but you want to make sure that you've indicated who you would prefer, because sometimes there are arguments in families which parent, which sibling is going to become the parent of these children. Is there going to be enough in the estate to leave to those children? Is it going to be given to them at the right time? So if you don't have a will, or you don't make any specification in your will as to when beneficiaries are going to receive the assets, it will default to the age of majority, which is 18 or 19, depending on which province you're in. And when we speak to clients, the universal answer is, no, I do not want that my child to receive $1 million estate when they're 18. And you may not think of yourself as a millionaire, but many Canadians are effectively leaving large assets because they have real property worth, they have homes and things like that worth a fair bit. So, and they also have insurance, they have other assets. So you may not have $1 million in your bank account, but when you add everything up, it can be a significant amount of money. And who's going to manage that? That's where the choice of executor is very important. Who's going to manage that money, and how is it going to be distributed? We also find that there are many, many clients who are in more complex family situations, but they're so socially acceptable that people don't even really think about the fact that there might be something unique to think about. So for example, you could be in a common law relationship and think, oh yeah, everything will go to my partner. Well, not if you live east of the Manitoba-Ontario border. So Ontario and Quebec, most of these provinces, common law couples, they might be treated the same for income tax purposes, but not necessarily always for estate purposes or property purposes, or, if you get separated. Whereas in the Western provinces, they usually are treated the same. So someone might think, oh, well, they're common law, we're not legally married, they're not entitled to anything. Actually, they are. So you want to make sure that whatever your assumption is, that it's verified with a lawyer, or you work with a company like Clear Estate that specializes in dealing with estates and drafting wills. So because everyone has a unique situation, and you want to make sure that the will is drafted to meet that unique situation. And we'll talk a little bit later about blended families and special needs beneficiaries, but there's all sorts of considerations that you may not have thought of, and you want to make sure that you've got that down in writing so that there's no dispute after the fact.
Absolutely. Can you give an example of when it's important for individuals to have a customized plan that's customized to their needs?
Well, one that I just referenced would be blended families. And, there's so many blended families in Canada that I think that people don't consider this to be unique. And it may not be unique from a social perspective, but that doesn't mean there's no unique issues to be considered from a legal perspective. So a blended family is any family where there is a step-parent, stepchild relationship. And it doesn't matter if you're living under the same home. We see many cases where people enter into second, third relationships later in life. So perhaps their spouse passed away, or one spouse is divorced, and they get remarried later on, and they have children from previous relationships, and they never live in the same house. So it's not about the living arrangements, it's about the legal relationship. So what can happen is people in these situations, they may say, well, when I was married the first time, I just put everything in joint ownership and I designated my spouse as the direct beneficiary of everything, or the direct beneficiary of all my assets in my will. And when my spouse died, I received everything and it worked out great. And I think they'll just do that this time. But that's may not be the right solution when there's stepchildren involved, because what can happen is when one spouse dies, everything does go to the survivor. But then what happens when they pass away, more often than not, is their assets go to their legal, or, so their natural or adoptive children. They don't go to the stepchildren, because in many cases, their will says it's to go to my children, or another legal term is issue. So issue means all your natural or adoptive children and their children. So, but the definition of children doesn't include stepchildren. And so I find that there's many clients who say, well, I would never, my spouse would never intentionally leave out, my children. It's not intentional. It's usually completely unintentional. One party dies, everything goes to the survivor. And then, who knows, it could be another 10, 20 years before that second spouse dies. They no longer have a relationship with the children from the first marriage, or they've sold everything or put everything in joint ownership with their other kids. It can be completely inadvertent, and it usually is, but it doesn't mean it's any less painful. And when you look at, a lot of the litigation and the arguments, it's because people didn't really think about these situations. And we always tell people, make sure you leave something to your children upon your death if you're in a blended family. So yes, you will likely need to leave a large portion of your estate to your new spouse, but would you be legally required to leave the entire thing? Highly unlikely. And this is where you need to work with a lawyer. So then would you, what would you leave to your children? Do you have enough? Should you buy a separate insurance policy? There's all sorts of, different solutions, but don't just assume it will work out, because unfortunately, in many cases, it does not.
Absolutely. Can you provide a few suggestions to help maintain family harmony in these situations and others?
Yeah, I will say that, the one instance where we do receive a lot of questions is for people who have children, multiple children, and they're saying, how do I divide an estate between my children? And the general answer, and I know that, you can't say that everyone needs to do the exact same thing, and it should be customized, but the general answer we give people is, fair may not mean equal, but when it comes to children, they will consider anything that's not equal to not be fair. They just will not. And I think some parents, they want to get involved because they think, oh, well, if I dictate who receives, which figurine on what shelf, there'll be less argument. And, it's like when your kids are young, the one who wants, if you give them toys, the one who got the blue truck wants the red truck, the one who got the red truck wants the blue truck. You can't, you just can't make them happy if you're dictating to them who's going to receive what. And I do recommend family meeting where, parents sit down with their children and say, so what would you like? How do you think this will be distributed? You'll be surprised as to which one is interested in which thing. And I think that a lot of parents assume that everything will just be divided equally, including real property and all sorts of things. And that's highly unlikely. And that's what tends to cause a lot of arguments. So our advice is just leave it equally in the context of, I'm going to, it's to be divided in 2 or 3 or whatever amount, but understand that your children can effectively barter between them and decide who's going to receive what as part of that half or that third. To think that they're going to each receive a third of a specific item and then somehow rotate it, that's the thing that causes arguments. Or, if I have seen situations where people say, well, I need to give more to so-and-so because this other child received more this other time. If you can, try and equalize those gifts during your lifetime, because if one child received $10,000 30 years ago to university, the other child's going to say, well, that $10,000 30 years ago is now worth $100,000 and I should be getting a different amount. And it just, again, you cannot win. So especially if you're, later in life and you're making gifts to one, just try and keep the gifts equal throughout, if that's possible, and leave the same amount in the will, because if you leave an unequal amount, that will be analyzed and analyzed and analyzed over and over again, and you won't be there to moderate the discussion, and people will be hurt. Obviously, though, if you no longer have a relationship with one particular child, well, then that's a different story. And that's why I don't want to be judgmental. Some people do cut out one particular child for a very specific reason, and that's certainly your prerogative. You don't have to leave it equally. But keep in mind, sometimes people, they reconcile later in life, and then they're on their deathbed and it's too late to change the will. Really think carefully about how you want to do that. And if you want to get too involved in dictating who gets what, try it, if at all possible, just leave it equally, and then let them work it out themselves.
That's a really good suggestion. Just keep it simple and equal. Yeah. Do you see any other patterns that more regularly cause arguments?
Yes. Well, one question that we get a fair bit relates to vacation properties. So we see, for whatever reason, parents don't seem to be overly concerned about what happens to the marital home. They assume that they'll be sold and people will have their own home, urban residence. But if there's any sort of cottage or ski chalet or something like that, likely because the kids don't have their own, they want to share that, and they think that everyone's going to share the property equally, and I'll, sit around the campfire singing Kumbaya. But that unfortunately is often not feasible, and it can work for a while. I certainly have seen some families share properties for a period of time, but then as those kids have their own kids and they have spouses and grandkids, like the property just becomes too small to manage all these people, and how do we share it, and who's going to contribute what? One sibling is fine repairing things all the time and upgrading, and the other sibling doesn't have any cash, or one sibling lives close by, so they feel like they're constantly being required to go check on the property, and it's the other child just gets to swoop in once a year and show up at the cottage for a week. So I would say really think carefully about whether or not keeping a vacation property is feasible. And again, talk to your kids. You may find that they're quite happy to visit you at the vacation property so long as you're alive and you're doing all the work and paying all the maintenance, but they have no intention of keeping the property once you pass on. So again, don't make any assumptions. But let's say there is one child that really wants their property. The advice then is to make sure that that child will either receive enough from the estate or have enough other assets to be able to buy out their siblings and keep that property. So let's say in our example, we have a cottage and it's worth $1 million today. And you've got 3 kids. And so you want to make sure that the assets are held equally or are distributed equally. First of all, if you're saying then, okay, well, if I want the one child to be able to take that $1 million property out of the estate, understand and acknowledge that, of course, they're not getting other assets. This is where the bartering comes in. The child says, yeah, there's this one property that I want. I will take that as my 1/3. Well, then the estate needs to be worth at least 3 times that amount. Now, what can happen sometimes is people say, oh, yeah, I have a property in the city. I have RSPs. I have other things. I have an estate worth $3 million. You might have an estate worth $3 million before tax, but do you have an estate worth $3 million after tax? And that is where you need to sit down with a financial planner who will do projections and will say, actually, well, the gain on one of you can usually, the gain on one property can be used as your principal residence. So there's a principal residence exemption. But if there's a gain on the second property, okay, is there a capital gain on one of your 2 properties? RSPs or RIFs are fully taxable at the time of death unless passed on to a spouse. So do you have that much after tax? If you don't, then either you can buy more insurance to make sure that there's enough there, or if there's this one child who really wants that asset, maybe that child can buy insurance to buy out that asset. And this is the type of planning that we do, whether it's a vacation property, a farm, a business, any large indivisible asset where one child wants something worth a lot more than the rest of the estate combined. There does need to be some planning, and insurance is the best way to maximize the after-tax value of an estate, because it's paid out completely tax-free. That's why permanent life insurance is so popular in the context of estate planning. But you have to do planning in advance, and you can't just assume that it'll all work out and everyone will get along. You have to run those numbers and understand what the tax consequence will be. But if everyone's getting a piece of the pie that's large enough, then they can each receive those large assets, and there'll be less cause for dispute.
Right. Can you talk about any other situations that require a little more care? For example, if there are beneficiaries with a disability.
Yes, this is a question that we get quite a bit. I have one child or one beneficiary that is special needs. How do I manage that? Again, very important to go speak with a lawyer, or, as I said, a company like Clear Estate, someone that can handle these sorts of unique situations. You likely wouldn't want to leave assets directly to that beneficiary, again, either through a direct beneficiary designation or directly in a will. In the case of someone with special needs, the more common planning technique is to leave the assets in what's called a Henson trust. So that's a fully discretionary trust. And the reason for that is people who are special needs in most provinces, they will qualify for various monthly benefits, a monthly income stipend, or sometimes specialized housing and medical benefits. The rules are different across the country, and it really depends how severe the disability is and whether or not they qualify. But there are many people who do qualify for these benefits. And if they all of a sudden receive an inheritance and they're, rich, and when I say rich, sometimes they receive $100,000, which, don't get me wrong, is a fair bit of money, but all of a sudden these people are cut off from social assistance, and they're cut off from various medical benefits, and they're really not rich, and they have to spend that money down before they requalify. It can be actually quite a bit of a burden. So it's important, again, to make sure that the estate assets flow properly, and likely wouldn't go directly to the beneficiary. They would go into the estate, go into a trust for that person's benefit, and they are a beneficiary, and the money can be distributed as the trustee or executor determines. But you want to make sure you're not causing more harm than intended by cutting them off from other benefits when you leave them in estate directly.
Right. Do you have any suggestions for when people should be updating their estate plan?
Well, people can go through lots of twists and turns in their life, and we generally recommend that people update their estate plan every 3 to 5 years, particularly if there's a lot of people who are single, and they don't necessarily have, a relationship or direct beneficiaries, and you want to make sure that the people or the charities that you've listed are still the organizations that are important to you. But we've also seen situations where clients have had a significant life change and they didn't update anything. So, if you get married or you enter into a serious relationship, have you contemplated that in your will? What happens if you have children? Again, guardianship, making sure you have enough estate. What happens if you no longer have a spouse, if you're separated or divorced? We've seen people, new clients have come to us, they've been separated for 10 to 15 years and they've still never changed their will. And they may not be legally divorced, so everything is still going to, to their ex-spouse, which comes as a shock to them. But it's not even, again, just the will. As we talked about at the very beginning, an estate plan can include, it's a will, it's power of attorney, very important beneficiary designations. And these situations come out, like they're reported in the newspaper, where someone has $1 million insurance policy. They designate a girlfriend as their direct beneficiary. They separate, enter into a new relationship, separate from that person. They're 3 relationships later, and they pass on, and the money goes to someone they haven't been in contact with for 20 years. Well, that's why you need to constantly update your estate plan to make sure it's going to the right person. So, and I'm not saying that everyone will absolutely have a life change every 3 to 5 years, but if you're not at least taking a look at it and brushing it off every 3 to 5 years, you could be surprised how much changes. People come in and they say, oh my goodness, I didn't realize my executor, I named my uncle and they passed away, or, I've named this other thing and I'm the organization, I'm not involved with them anymore. Like, a lot can change in 3 to 5 years. So make sure that you do take a regular look at it, and hopefully with assistance from your financial planner or other people who are capable of providing some guidance.
Right. You mentioned separation and divorce. Are there any specific things we should look out for in that situation?
Well, I do, as I just mentioned, have you updated your wills and powers of attorney? We've seen some very bad situations. And I find when people get separated or divorced, they're almost paralyzed and they don't know what to do. They're also under this assumption that they can't do anything, which is absolutely not true. You should probably be changing all of your beneficiaries from your spouse to estate and not to someone else necessarily, certainly not your 4-year-old child or something like that. But the reason we recommend estate is, yes, let's say hypothetically amount is owing to your spouse. Well, that will come off the top. But in almost no case I've ever seen when a spouse be entitled to 100%. So if then the remainder of your estate, where does that go? Okay, maybe that's going to your 4-year-old child. Well, that should go through your will and that should go into a trust. And when do they get it? And who's the executor? Maybe it's not your former spouse, those sorts of things. So make sure that you do update your will, you do update your beneficiary designations. We're not huge fans. I think beneficiary designations are heavily overused and can cause a significant amount of litigation because people will designate one of their 3 kids, or they'll designate a minor, or like it just can cause a lot of litigation. So I'd say the default would be to designate a state and have it distributed through your will, because people do think about things more carefully when they're doing your will. But make sure that you do update all of those items. Again, powers of attorney, it's all part and parcel of that. That would be a key time to speak to a lawyer and make sure everything is up to date. And your financial planner. You might need to change your insurance policies, your retirement plan, the whole thing. That is a key life inflection point, and you need to get help.
Right. Can you talk a little bit about grandchildren? Should that trigger a change in your estate plan?
As a general rule, I'd say no. I find that we do receive a lot of questions from clients. They say, oh, I now have a grandchild, I need to update things. That can make things very complicated. And what can happen is they change their will when they have the first grandchild and they say, I want to leave $10,000 or $50,000 to this one grandchild. And then they never update their will again. And 6 more grandchildren are born later and they don't get that money, or they're born after the time of death. And again, they don't get the same amount. Or we've seen situations where one child had 4 children and another child had no children. And so a large portion of the estate is going to that one child, that one branch of the family, and it can cause animosity. For the most part, we would recommend just leaving it to the next generation and letting them decide how the money is spent. We've also seen situations where grandparents left, even let's say amount like $10,000 to grandchildren who are they're adults, but the money was, they did their will when the grandchildren were young and cute and sweet, and then the grandchildren are 19 and they get the money and they have a drug addiction or there's some problem, and the parents are actually quite beside themselves that this child is getting $10,000. You can do a lot of damage if you're struggling with something, and they don't want them to get the money, but they don't have any control over it. The grandparent, when they were 3, they put this in their will, and now they're getting, so in my experience, it tends to cause much more hassle than it's worth. And we recommend that clients not give direct gifts to grandchildren, but there certainly are exceptions. I mean, what happens if the child has predeceased? If the parent isn't there, then it obviously has to go to the grandchild. So I don't want to say never. I would just say be very, very careful and understand that it can severely complicate an estate.
For sure. Can you talk a little bit about people that have other goals or causes that are important to them and how they can incorporate charitable giving into their plan?
Well, as I just mentioned, I mean, first of all, there are many clients who don't have a spouse or children, and they don't have obvious family members. So that's the first thing to think about. But even those who do have a family, they have other causes that are important to them. And so, I do find as, people get older and they're thinking about retirement, they want to have a purpose in life and they have a connection. So there are many clients who are quite strongly affiliated with various charities, or they've had a family member go through something difficult. So for example, the Alzheimer's Society, we're obviously the big corporate sponsor for the Alzheimer Walk every spring. And we see all these people who've been so significantly impacted by dementia. And so you can tell that it's very important to them. They're concerned about the next generation, will I also have the same thing? So they want to donate to research. So I think it's important to think about, what is it that you yourself want to achieve in terms of leaving a legacy. So on the next couple slides, we just have a couple of examples of why people give. As I mentioned, human connection, emotional motivators, what kind of impact do they want to leave with that organization, sense of belonging, because some people, as I said, they volunteer and they're very involved with that organization. It gives them a sense of purpose. It can also leave a legacy for their children. So we have many clients who say, well, I want to make sure that my children don't receive 100% of my estate because I want to leave a message. It's not all about you, right? Like there was something else there. And it's been proven scientifically that, the more you give, the more you get, from an emotional and well-being standpoint, and in some cases, even from a financial or tax perspective. So think about how you want to incorporate that into your estate plan, because it can make a big difference. And for our own discussions in terms of income tax, I do think it's important that people understand that there are some significant benefits. There are federal and provincial non-refundable tax credits that a lot of people don't realize. So, when you're doing an estate plan, think about how to maximize those benefits. And if you're not sure, again, it's important to speak with a financial planner, someone who has access to good financial planning software, can do tax analysis for you. Hopefully we'll be able to liaise with your accountant. And what kind of gift do you want to leave and how. Understand that if you transfer any sort of publicly traded securities, which could include a mutual fund, that the capital gain on those publicly traded securities is reduced to zero. So instead of having to pay 50% capital gain, that the estate won't have to pay any capital gain on those securities, and the estate will still receive, or if you do it during your lifetime, you will still receive a tax receipt for the full amount of the securities. So if you gave a stock that you paid $1,000 for and that's now worth $10,000, you don't have to pay any tax on the $9,000 capital gain, and you still get the tax receipt for $10,000. So it's great tax planning, and it maximizes the value of what you want to leave to the charity. The other thing that a lot of people don't realize is available is many organizations, including IG, have created donor advised funds, or basically public charitable foundations. So we have the IG Wealth Management Charitable Giving Program, which is effectively a charitable parking lot. So what can happen is people are planning their estate and they're overwhelmed and say, oh my gosh, I don't know exactly who I want to leave things to. I know I want to leave 10% of my estate or $100,000 or whatever specific amount to charity, but I haven't exactly decided who or when or how. And they can put off signing their will in some cases for years because they can't make that one decision. And then they end up passing intestate, which is not what you want. What you can do is say in your will, what I've done in my will is I've said I want a certain percentage of my estate to go to the IG Charitable Giving Program. But then when I'm deciding who to give it to, I speak to my IG advisor and I've said, look, here are the whatever half a dozen charities I want it to be divided by. If next year I change my mind, I don't have to change my will. I just go back to my IG advisor and say, okay, now I want it to be these other charities. So it makes it very easy for tax planning. You get one tax receipt. It's very easy in terms of administration and cost. And you can actually have an amount that goes in there and stays. You can keep the capital there and just pay out the income every year. So if you pay out 5%, but you earn 5%, that money can keep going. We have a lot of families, they want their children to keep that amount going, and they pay out, they could pay out 5% to Alzheimer's every year and have it going as a long-term legacy. So, and I think sometimes people think, well, I have to be a gajillionaire to have a private foundation. Actually, you can open up a public foundation account at IG for $10,000. So it's very accessible, especially in the context of estate planning, and it can make a big, big difference.
Yeah, that's a really great opportunity for people. What kind of taxes might your estate face when you pass away?
Yeah, this is where we receive many, many questions, and I think there's a lot of confusion. And ironically, we get a lot of questions about probate fees when they're so small and tiny and irrelevant. And we get almost no questions about income taxes, which are massive. So I think there's a lot of cocktail party advice and a lot of confusion about taxes. And so I'm going to start by talking about income taxes. We often at IG, we talk about the big tax and the little tax, and this is the big tax. Probate fees are the little tax. Income taxes are the big tax. And so what happens is, when you pass, you will have income to the date of death. And that can include what I'll call your regular income. So pensions, interest, dividends. But then there could be some very distinctive items. So you're deemed to have disposed of all your capital assets. And when I was talking about the vacation property example, I said, well, if you own multiple properties, yeah, sure, you can, protect the capital gain on one property as your principal residence, but what about those other properties? What if you own rental properties or, a farm or a business? If those assets have a capital gain, then 50% of that gain is going to be included in your terminal year tax return, because that's the last chance that the CRA can tax it. It's hasn't been taxed up until then, but at that point, there's a deemed disposition. And on top of that, let's say you put money into an RSP or RIF, those are fantastic structures. They're great tax deferrals, but at some point, so you put the money in there, you get a tax deduction, it grows tax deferred. If you pass away before you've drawn that down, all that money is taxable. So, in this example, someone passes away 3/4 through the year. They normally earned $80,000 a year, but because they passed away 3/4 through the year, they earned $60,000 in that year. So you'd think, oh, they're going to have less tax. Yeah, except for the fact that they have an investment portfolio with a capital gain. So they have to pay, I just noticed a typo. The taxable income is 200,000 times 50%, not 2 million. So it's 200,000 times 50%. So that's $100,000 in tax. And then the fair market value of the RSP is 300,000. So the total taxable income is 460. So you've got an individual who's used to making $80,000 a year. They're now in the year of death, they made 460. It's a good thing you're dead, because the tax bill would kill you. You'd have a heart attack if you saw that, right? So people, that's the part that people just are sort of shocked about. If you had to come up with, $200,000 of tax, because that's the taxable income, depending on which province you're in, and you're obviously in the highest tax bracket, right? So that's at least some of it's taxed at the highest tax bracket. Where are you going to get that 200,000? Well, probably from selling, various assets in your RSP or RIF, but you can see why, when I was talking about the example with the cottage, you can see why people don't necessarily, they're not able to keep all the assets that they thought about, because, it's just, they have to liquidate something to pay that tax. So we also do get questions then, is there any way to minimize tax? And there are a few things. Well, first of all, the one thing I want to reassure people is that usually the tax bill doesn't crack open until everyone in the first generation passes away. So when the assets roll over to the spouse or partner, then there's no tax. And then going back to the example with the blended family situation, I know a lot of people that say, well, I want to leave everything to my spouse because everything's going to roll over. Well, sure, but then nothing's going to your kids from your first marriage. So you have to balance the tax and the estate objectives. But yeah, any assets that are going to a spouse or trust in favor of a spouse, those could roll over. So that's why it's usually not an issue until the second spouse passes away. At that point, yes, we do have the principal residence exemption. So sure, you could avoid tax on one property, but if you own more than one property, that's where, there could be a bigger issue. And the third way that you can try and minimize tax is through charitable giving, which we just talked about. Now, that doesn't mean that more assets are going to your children. It just means less assets are going to the CRA, because you're leaving assets to charity and you're getting a tax deduction. And so more money is going to places like the Alzheimer's or wherever and not going to the CRA. So there certainly are things you can do, but understand that there's no magic bullet. And trust me, adding on a joint owner, adding on a direct beneficiary doesn't do anything. to minimize this tax, and in fact can cause all sorts of other tax problems. So understand that it's a bigger issue that you need to speak to your advisors about, and don't recommend do-it-yourself tax planning.
Fair. You mentioned them, but are probate fees then something to worry about?
I find that people worry about them to a disproportionate amount. And I live in Manitoba where we don't even have probate fees. They're zero. In Alberta, they're $500, no matter how big your estate is. So people, they cause themselves a huge amount of issue over a small amount of fee. The highest probate fees in Canada are in places like Ontario and BC, where they're about 1.5%. We have the leading financial planning software. It's Conquest software. Conquest doesn't even include probate fees in their projections because it's so immaterial. Income taxes is the thing that is very much focused on in the software, because you do have to plan for income taxes. But we get a lot of questions about probate fees because that's what tends to really burn people. They seem to be quite upset about it. But people need to understand what it is. So what happens is if someone passes away and they have assets in their estate, so things that aren't going through direct beneficiaries or joint ownership, then it becomes a question, who's entitled to that? Okay, well, what's said in the will? Okay, well, is that the last will? Was the person of sound mind when they wrote it? Is there another will? Are there going to be arguments? So the executor has to go to the probate court and have it stamped, and someone say, yeah, this is the last will. So the financial institution or the land titles office can act on that will and not get sued. When they go to the probate court can charge a fee. But as I said, it's a nominal amount. I will say, if you have $1 million estate and you're paying $15,000 in probate fees, that's annoying. But what people will do in some cases, they'll just, as I said, they'll add on one of their 3 children as a direct beneficiary of their $1 million insurance policy to avoid $15,000 in probate fees, and don't realize that they've just disinherited 2 of their children. They say, oh, well, no, my will says everything's to be divided in 3. Yeah, except you just said you don't want it to go through your will. Which is it? Is it going directly to that one child, or is it going to be divided in 3 according to your will? Like, you have to decide. And we've seen many very unfortunate situations where people have this beautifully drafted will, and then they add on all sorts of joint owners and direct beneficiaries, and not specifically so that it doesn't go through their estate. And so the will is irrelevant. And then there's all this litigation. And the judges, you can tell they're so frustrated. They say, oh my gosh, these families are spending tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees because their parent wanted to, save a few $100s in probate. So it can be very, very tragic. And when people say, how do I avoid arguments with my family, of minimize probate planning. So here's a situation where a widower had 2 children. He had $100 million in his RSP. So he said, I'm going to designate that child as the direct beneficiary of that. And then I have other assets, $1 million in non-registered investments, and I can't designate a direct beneficiary. So my second child will receive that in the will. The problem is the child who was the direct beneficiary of the RSPs does get the $1 million because the financial institution pays them out. But as I mentioned before, RSPs are fully taxable in the year of death. So the estate has to include $1 million, even though it didn't get a dollar. It went directly to the direct beneficiary. So now the CRA says, okay, well, you owe us $500,000 on that. And they say, well, that's great because we've got a different $1 million. So we'll sell half of that. So what do we have left? Okay, well, now we have $500,000 left. So the second child gets $500,000, not $1 million. So the client in this particular situation saved $15,000 in probate fees, but one child is getting half of what the other child is getting. Like, when you want to talk ruining family relationships, like, I realize that people do want to save probate fees, but make sure you speak with a professional. We do not recommend do-it-yourself estate kits, will kits, power of attorney kits, probate planning, none of that stuff, because it just tends to cause a lot of agony and not good results.
Can life insurance help cover estate taxes?
Insurance is the most tax-effective way to maximize the after-tax value of your estate. And I think that, I know that when people are younger and they're being told you need insurance because you need to create an estate, it can cause, people to think of insurance negatively because they think of it as an expense where they never see anything. But as you get older, insurance will become a much bigger and more important part of your overall financial plan, because it can help to preserve the value of the estate or equalize an estate. So I gave examples of, when we were talking about the vacation property, and I said, yeah, you think you have a $3 million estate, but after tax, if it's $1 million of RSPs or RIFs, maybe you only have $2.5 million of assets. And you want to leave $1 million to each of your 3 kids. So you want that $3 million. What's the most effective way to get that extra $500,000? Insurance, because the premium will be tiny compared to the the death benefit, and the insurance is paid out completely tax-free. It is the most tax-effective investment strategy we have in terms of estate planning. During your lifetime, I'd say TFSAs are the most tax-effective because the TFSAs are paid out completely tax-free. But it depends on what your circumstance is. And so for us, when we do our financial plans, as I said, we use Conquest software. So oftentimes we're talking to clients about their retirement plan and their major purchase goals. So they want to retire at a certain age, they might want to buy a cottage, or they have an education goal for their children. And at a certain point, they achieve all those things, and they get to 150% of their retirement goal, and they're overshooting certain things depending on their stage of life. That may not be happening when they're in their 20s or 30s, but eventually they get to the point where they have more than enough for their current needs. So the next question then becomes, how do I maximize the value of my estate? Permanent life insurance, because it'll create the most leverage and it will be paid out tax-free. But again, you have to balance that between your current needs and your future needs and what's affordable and what's the best way to do it. But I think that insurance is for many Canadians underutilized, particularly in the context of charitable giving. We've seen many people make massive charitable gifts based on pretty modest premium payments, and it's just been a huge boon for their estate. But you have to do some planning in advance and be open to seeing where the software leads you in terms of what the best balance is.
Right. I know we're switching gears here, and I know we're coming close to time. I am keeping an eye on the Q&A, so
Yes.
we'll get to all those questions. Just we have a few more slides to go. So Christine, can you tell us a little bit about what an executor does and how you choose the right one?
The executor basically makes all the decisions that you won't be making. You won't be here to decide. You will decide who gets your assets by virtue of what goes in your will, but they will be the ones to sell everything, divide it. And it's a huge job. So you should be asking them in advance, are they willing to do it? Are they capable of doing it? Do they live close by? Are they Canadian resident at minimum? You do not want to choose someone who lives in the States or anywhere outside of Canada. They may not even be approved by a court. It can be, and there can be tax consequences to that. So if you don't have a family member that you trust or that's capable, consider a corporate trustee. There are companies, as I mentioned, Clear Estate will provide executor services for a very reasonable fee. But, obviously it's a big job, right? So that, yes, they are going to charge a fee, but your beneficiaries will thank you in the end because it is a huge job. And some beneficiaries are just overwhelmed. They're paralyzed. They're emotional. They're dealing with a death. Now they have to manage all these other things. They've never done it before. They don't know how to file a terminal year tax return. They don't know how to apply for probate. The beneficiaries are arguing. It's a thankless job. So think carefully before you just appoint someone.
For sure. Along the same vein, can you talk about what a power of attorney is and why it's important?
So again, that's the person who's going to make decisions on your behalf, but you'll still be alive. So it's when you lose a capacity to make decisions. So they're going to be deciding, potentially what sort of assisted living or personal care that you're getting, what amounts are they willing to pay out on your behalf to make sure you get enough care? Who's going to be making those decisions? Do you trust them? Do you want to make sure that they're not going to abuse their situation or take advantage of it or use the money for their own personal purposes? Again, absolutely make sure they're a resident of Canada. Don't choose a non-resident. Have they spoken to your financial planner? Do they know what's required? Do they know what kind of accounting they need to keep? And if you don't have anyone capable of doing the job, again, consider corporate services like a clear estate type of company who will do it for you for a fee.
Absolutely. Okay, wrapping everything up, can you talk about what steps would you recommend people take when planning their legacy?
Well, the first thing you should do is think about who you want to, benefit from your estate. Who are your beneficiaries? Is that family, friends? I wouldn't. Sometimes people come to us with a list of 27 people. They're the person who does their lawn and all that kind of stuff. And what we find in many cases, they want to leave a token amount to various people. It might almost be easier if you want to leave someone $5,000, just give it to them now. Like depending on your personal situation. But if for bigger amounts, like which family members and which charities do you want to leave a large amount to that'll have a long-term impact. Secondly, get professional help. I recommend that you start with a financial planner. And again, a financial planner, not just an investment advisor, not someone who just picks stocks and bonds, someone who deals with tax planning, estate planning, insurance as well. So someone who's got their certified financial planner, CFP designation, someone who deals with this regularly and is able to navigate through this with you, and also works with lawyers and accountants or companies like Clear Estate on a regular basis. So they're going to know, because it might take multiple people to put all the pieces together, and you want to make sure you've got access to all that expertise. Thirdly, be open-minded to the benefits of insurance. When you're younger, you may have been told you need insurance. As you get older, you may realize you want insurance because it is paid out tax-free. And then fourth, update your legal documents. Make sure, review them on occasion. We talked about reviewing them every 3 to 5 years. But if you have any sort of major life event happen, think about updating your documents, because many people talk and talk and talk about doing this, but they never actually execute. And you need to make sure that you do have something in place. Otherwise, the court system and the legislation will just distribute your assets maybe in a way that you didn't intend.
Absolutely.
So that's it.
Thank you so much, Christine. I'll move right into the Q&A if that's okay.
Sure.
Perfect. So a great question here is, what recommendations would you have for people who don't have children but have elderly parents with special needs, and who they want people to make sure they're taken care of?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first question is, are you leaving assets to them? Again, I would highly recommend that you speak with an estates lawyer, someone who deals with these issues regularly, because if you're going to leave assets to them, who's going to manage that money? So if you're creating a trust, so if you don't have any family members, again, there's companies like Clear Estate, they will manage the trust. They charge an executor fee, but they will then make sure that the money is paid out every month to take care of the elderly parent. All of that is part of what's dealt with in advance. In some cases, people are saying, well, my parents, they will be taken care of. I want my assets to actually go to charity, because I'm not sure if my parents are going to live long enough to receive all that money. So also then think about that and speak to your intended beneficiaries, and if they're charity. So you could say, I'm leaving it to my parents, but if they predecease me, it's going to XYZ charity. Or as I said, you can leave it to a donor advised fund, and then work with the fund to determine, the pace at which it will be paid out, and whether or not that'll be long term. But that's a situation where you definitely should be getting professional advice.
For sure. The next question is more of a case study, I guess. So I want to leave some money to 4 children, currently all under 8 years old, who live in the US. What should I know about how to do this, and what the financial impact could be on their parents?
Well, I mean, I guess the first question is, why are you leaving it to the children and not the parents? So that's a hard discussion to have without, if you're leaving it to minors, you want to make sure it's in a trust. Who's going to manage the trust? They don't live in Canada. You'd have to, are the parents going to be the trustees? When is the money going to be paid out? And are there then US tax consequences? So yeah, I mean, that leaving gifts to minors can get very complicated very quickly, and the money often has to be held for many, many years, and there's cost to all of that, filing tax returns, all those sorts of things. So I think you'd have to talk to an advisor about how best to do that, because that's definitely going to bring with it a whole set of complications.
That's where all these unique plans come in.
Yeah.
Another one is, does capital property include my residence?
Yes, but as I said, the principal residence exempt. So you're going to be deemed to have disposed of all your capital property at the time of death, but the capital gain on your principal residence is exempt.
Okay, fantastic. You also mentioned Clear Estate a few times. Do you mind expanding on what that platform is?
Yeah, Clear Estate. So that's not IG Wealth Management. That's a separate company. So they are a company that's just focused on estate administration and estate planning. So they're very digitally advanced. So you would go to them. They have created a digital vault. They keep track of all of your assets. They would help you draft a will and power of attorney. If it's more complicated, like you need a shareholders agreement or domestic contract, they partner with lawyers in your community. But I will say in many cases, they're able to, if your situation is fairly straightforward, they'll then keep the power of attorney on file. You can, depending on which package you want, you can appoint them as your attorney, your power of attorney, your executor. They will then manage the estate for your children. And I've chosen them to manage my estate for my child. I'm married now, but I mean, at second death, and my son's 19, but I mean, I don't want all that money to go to him directly. So, who gets what, how it will be distributed. They file the terminal year tax return. They apply for probate. They deal with assets in foreign jurisdictions. That's their whole business model. And they're very digitally enabled. So they're able to do it in a very efficient manner. And that's the company that we partner with the most, because they've got a lot of experience in dealing with that. Going to a lawyer is fine, but that's very transactional. So you go, you get your will, you pay your fee. They are unlikely to call you again. With Clear Estate, as I said, they've got a digital vault. They phone you every year. So there's an annual update. It's kind of like if you come to IG and you're working with a financial planner, we will do an annual review of your financial plan to make sure your retirement plan is still on track. With Clear Estate, they do an annual review to make sure your estate is still on track. And that's not something you're going to get with a lawyer who's, unless you're willing to pay the legal fee every year. So that's why we use Clear Estate.
Yeah, that sounds like an amazing business, truthfully. I know at Alzheimer Society, part of my role is just processing the bequests that are coming in and speaking with the executors that are managing that. It's a lot of work. So having, an expert to hold your hand and do a lot of that that's huge. That's great. Thank you for suggesting that.
Yes. So even for my husband and I, if my husband were to pass away, I practice in estates. I don't want to deal with it. Like, please, I'll pay someone else to deal with this. So yeah, that's their whole business.
Amazing. Well, thank you. That's all of the questions we have here. Christine, I really want to thank you for being our guest speaker. And oh, sorry, I think maybe I saw a hand go up. I just don't see another question. Sorry.
I will say, if you have any questions, we have IG Wealth Advisors across the country. We have a strong relationship with Alzheimer's, and Clear Estate also has a strong relationship with IG. And you can say, you're listening to this presentation, you can reach out to Clear Estate, you can reach out to IG, and we're happy to talk to you and, sort of determine what your needs may or may not be. And there's many people who are very capable of having these discussions, and I would encourage you to reach out.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. Again, this is recorded and I'll be sending a follow-up after. So thank you to everyone that participated. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Christine, and happy Make a Will month, by the way. It's November, so I hope everyone is ready to take action this month.
Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.